Dr. Emily Colgan is Senior Lecturer in Biblical Studies at Trinity Theological College, and her research focuses on the relationship between the Bible and contemporary social imaginaries, asking about the degree to which ideologies contained within biblical texts continue to inform communities in the present. Emily is particularly interested in ecological representations in the Bible, as well as depictions of gender and violence. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I don't know that this is on.
Yes, it is. It is, I think.
You good? Okay, excellent.
Kia ora.
And kia ora mai tātou, e mihi nui ana kia koutou katoa. Shalom, Erev Tov to my Jewish brothers and sisters. Assalamu alaikum to my Muslim brothers and sisters. It is such a privilege to be here tonight, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Christchurch. Thank you. For the Antarctic Ice Week. And I was part of a panel speaking on this theme. Christchurch is one of only 5 gateway cities to Antarctica, and so each year they run a week of events focusing on Antarctica and the massively important role it plays in global climate patterns. It was a pretty amazing panel to be on that included the head of Antarctic Scientific Research in New Zealand, the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor, and it's fair to say that I was completely out of my depth, at least scientifically speaking. But probably the biggest takeaway from that panel for me was this idea that scientific fact by itself is not enough to motivate people to action. The shared messages coming from these preeminent scientists was the realization that it's not enough to keep ramming terrifying scientific fact after terrifying scientific fact down people's throats. The question they all kept coming back to was, how do we get people to care enough to change? And for me, this is a really crucial question, because for more than 50 years now, scientific leaders have been warning us that climate change is real, that it's already causing irrevocable damage to the planet. And yet, despite climate change being acknowledged as among the most critical issues faced by our planet, this unprecedented threat to Earth has failed to galvanise humanity, and questions remain as to whether the political will exists to address the situation quickly and effectively. Scientific fact alone, it seems, is not enough to counter what Thomas Berry calls the deep cultural pathology that enables humanity to cause such damage without thought of long-term consequence. Berry argues that these warnings must also find a degree of coherence with the religious and philosophical foundations that underlie the way in which human communities perceive themselves and their relationship to the surrounding environment. Oh, there was a quote there. Sorry about that. It's so good. We can move to the next slide. Cool. And this is where I think faith communities come into it. Globally, over 5.5 billion people identify as belonging to a religious tradition or a faith community. Of that 5.5 billion, 2.3 billion are Christian, 1.9 billion are Muslim, and 14.7 million are Jewish. That's a serious amount of people power. That's a serious amount of pull power. Imagine if you could mobilize even half that number of people for radical climate action in the world. Now, I realize I'm probably preaching to the converted, but I think faith communities need to get serious, like life or death serious, about our role and responsibility in this climate crisis. Because, because as Christian theologian Rosemary Radford Ruther argues, the vast majority of religious people in the world are far more likely to be persuaded of an ecological consciousness if they see that it grows from the soil in which they are planted. So, all this is just a very long-winded way of saying that faith communities have a crucial role to play alongside scientists, policymakers, and government leaders. One of the things I'm really interested in exploring is how Christian communities might respond positively to the climate crisis. And this, of course, involves critical reflection on our traditions, but also searching these traditions to seek more ecologically life-giving insights. Over the past 50 years or so, I'm not ready for that yet, that's all good. Oh no, go back. I'll give you the nod. Cool, thank you. Over the past 50 years or so, Christians have been strongly criticized for their attitude towards the environment. In particular, the way Christians have used biblical texts to enable, justify, legitimize ecological destruction. I thought we might explore this a little bit in a little bit more depth with a couple of familiar texts from the book of Genesis. But I just need to be very clear, of course, at the outset, that these are interpretations as they appear from within the Christian tradition. Obviously, they are interpreted and understood in different ways in other faith traditions. One of the projects I've been involved in for a number of years now is called the Earth Bible Project. Now, the Earth Bible Project provides one way of reading the Bible from a Christian perspective in the context of ecological degradation. This reading strategy is unique within Christianity in that it requires a radical reorientation to the biblical text. Earth is placed at the center of the interpretation, and questions are asked of Earth's presence in the text. So, in ecological interpretation, Earth is not a theme for analysis. Earth is autonomous. It is an agent in its own right, a subject or a character within the text. This approach emphasizes reflection with Earth and attempts to perceive reality from Earth's perspective. This way of reading the Bible involves a three-step process to interpret the text. The three steps are suspicion, identification, and retrieval. So the first task is that of suspicion. When approaching a text that relates to Earth or any part of the Earth community, interpreters may suspect that the Christian history of interpretation has been anthropocentric, regarding the rest of the Earth community and the Earth itself as inferior creatures. That is, biblical interpretation within Christianity has been primarily interested in the relationship between God and humanity. And so some of the questions that this step involves asking include, where is the Earth in this text? How is the Earth presented in this text? How do other characters engage with the Earth in this text? And are there texts in the Bible where the voices of Earth and Earth's community are present but have been ignored because of the mindset of past interpreters? The next step is the step of identification. Identification is described as coming to terms with one's deep ecological connections, where, as an interpreter or as a reader, we are able to reposition ourselves as self-consciously part of the Earth. And so when we read biblical texts, we're mindful that we read as creatures of earth, as members of the earth community, and in solidarity with earth. Read from the perspective of an interconnected member of this community, a new level of sensitivity emerges. We're sensitive to the experience of the earth in the text. This stage is about becoming an advocate for the earth, representing, arguing for, and supporting the presence of this character within the biblical text. And so we ask, how might the earth experience the events described in the text? The final task of retrieval acknowledges that the earth is already speaking and acting within a biblical text. This process listens to and learns from the silenced or ignored voice of the earth. This step is about hearing earth as a character communicating its story. This voice need not correspond to the language of human words associated with human voices. And so we ask, how might we retrieve the experience of earth that has been suffocated by human readers who focus on human interests? And this step is about articulating this communication. So, how might we go about doing an ecological reading of a biblical text? I want to have a look at the creation texts in Genesis because, as a number of eco-theologians have argued, Genesis 1 at least has played a hugely significant role in how Christians perceive themselves in relation to the earth and the other than human community. So, let's have a look at this text. Initially at least, earth is a partner in the creation process. Earth's soil brings forth all kinds of vegetation. Animals emerge from the ground. In verses 11, 12, and 24. The sea brings forth life in its oceans. All creatures have a common kinship that derives from earth. And God sees that it is good. God affirms, God values, and celebrates the birth of earth. But in verses 26 to 28, we see that humans are made a little bit differently. They're made in the image of God and given the mandate to dominate, fill, and subdue the earth. We read, God blessed them and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. Christian interpreters have typically understood this text as placing humans at the pinnacle of creation, thus diminishing the value of the other than human community. Indeed, not only has Christian interpretation affirmed this text as establishing human beings as master over the environment, but it has also been claimed that this text depicts as God's will the exploitation of nature to serve human interests. Contemporary eco-theologians suggest that this Christian interpretation of the world and the absolute belief in human superiority has led to behaviour that has been ecologically devastating. In traditional Christian interpretation, humans are not part of the earth in any way. We are made in the image of God and given the mandate to dominate, fill, and subdue the earth. Elsewhere in the Bible, this word dominion is used to describe what kings and taskmasters do. They dominate their subjects and their enemies. The word subdue is used elsewhere to mean crush underfoot and to subjugate. So these are words that have violent overtones, and traditionally, Christian interpreters have understood the relationship between humanity and earth as characterized by violence, hierarchy, and disconnection. So, are there other biblical texts that might help contribute to an alternative narrative for Christian communities, which try to make sense of our place and purpose in the world in a different way? And we don't have to look very far to find Genesis chapter 2. Typically, Christian interpreters of this text understand the main characters to be God, the man, the woman, and perhaps the snake, who comes a little bit later. But what about the earth? In verse 5, we learn that there is no vegetation on earth because there is no one to serve earth and nurture her. So, God takes some soil from earth and molds it into a human being. Here, humans are created from earth, for earth. God gives the human the task of completing what is missing at the beginning of the story. The human has the task of greening earth. Ooh. In verse 15 we read, Then the Lord God took the human and put him in the Garden of Eden to serve and preserve it. The first and most fundamental human work here is to serve and preserve earth. In the Bible, serving is what people did when they devoted their attention to a person or task. Members of the court, for example, served the king. Priests and worshippers served God. In verse 19, earth helps God to create the animals and birds. And there's kinship between these creatures and the human being. They both originate in the earth's fertile soil. Earth is their common ancestor, and God their creator. Within Genesis 2, then, humanity is part of a single unfolding reality. This text depicts an intimacy between God, humanity, and the whole earth community. Humanity is not separate from God or earth. There is a continuity of life. In this text, we are deeply connected to, and indeed utterly dependent on, both God and earth. Recognizing our connection with earth in this way carries with it strong ethical dimensions. To perceive ourselves as beings who depend upon others and upon whom others depend requires broadening our gaze to include genuine consideration of all living beings. And this is a huge shift from our current orientation within Christianity. I want to point out here that the image of relationship that we've drawn from Genesis 2 here does not intend to provide solutions to the intricate and complex issues specific to the climate crisis. Rather, this biblical vision and others found elsewhere within the biblical text provide Christian communities with a foundation for reconceiving the relationship between God, earth, and humanity, from which these communities might then address the multiplicity of issues related to the ecological crisis. In emphasizing connectedness, mutual relationality, service, and subjectivity, this text provides an alternative to the human-centered outlook, which is often implicit in Christian liturgies, worship, and our ideas about justice and morality. Set alongside the ever-increasing scientific discoveries that point towards interdependence and the continuity of all life, this text and others like it has the potential to act as a powerful resource for Christian communities in the ongoing endeavour to alleviate environmental degradation. Thank you.